Hey 8th graders, this is Miss Ludwig. We are doing your Evolution 2 notes, and we are going to talk about how do we know that, what kind of evidence do we have for evolution? How do we know that things have changed gradually over time? And here on the screen we see a few different pictures of some of the things that we're going to be talking about. First is the fossil record. We talked about the fossil record in our geology unit. We know that the fossil record is a record of all the fossils that we have found as humans, and it shows how things have changed over time. If you remember correctly, the law of superposition, we talked about the lower fossils and rock layers are things that are older, and then over time, as we get to the top of these different layers of sedimentary rock that have fossils in them, that these things have happened more recently. And we've also can see in the fossil record that as we go through these bottom older layers in the fossils that we find, like trilobites, these organisms were much more simple in their characteristics. And as we go through time on up through here, things get more and more complex. Different types of organisms start to appear. We have plants rather than just animals. And the features of these organisms are more complex or fancy, if you will. So the fossil record shows us that even before we were here to see things, in these bottom sedimentary rock layers and fossils, we have more simple organisms, and there's only one type of fossil down here. And as we go through time and get into more recent events, in these younger fossils, we have more organisms and we have more complex organisms. Another piece of evidence for evolution are transitional fossils. Transitional fossils are fossils that show us how things have changed over time. When we look at a specific type of organism. So if you look down here at these examples, this here today is the gray whale. All right, we can notice that the nostrils are at the top of the skull of our current modern gray whale. But if we look back through time, 50 million years ago, we had this ancestor of a gray whale called the Pakicetus that lived about 50 million years ago. And when we look at the nostrils of that Pakicetus, we see that the nostrils are here at kind of the front of the snout almost. And then about 25 million years ago, we have the Adiocetus, another ancestor of the gray whale. And we notice that this is our transitional fossil, our middle kind of ground for this gray whale. And we notice that the nostrils are now in the middle of the head. And then now, in the current gray whale, we have the nostrils at the top. So again, a transitional fossil is just kind of a middle piece. It shows how long time ago, 50 million years ago, we have the Pakicetus with a nostril here at the front. And then the Adiocetus, 25 million years ago, is our transitional piece because our nostrils now kind of moved to the middle of the head. And then now our gray whale, the nostril has moved to the top. So transitional fossils, again, just show that things have changed very slowly over time. Another piece of evidence that we use for evolution is comparative anatomy. Remember, the word anatomy just refers to body parts, and comparative means we are comparing those structures of different organisms. If you look at the top here, we have 4 different limbs of different organisms. The first one is a human arm. The second one is a cat's leg. The third one is the fin of a whale. And then the last one, the fourth one, is a bat wing. Now we can see that all of these structures are very different and they're all different species of organisms. However, when we look inside of these structures, we see that the bones are actually very similar. If you remember back to 7th grade when we talked about bones, at the top here we have a humerus in the human arm. That's like the top part of your arm. This cat leg has that same bone structure. Even a whale's fin has the same structure, and then a bat's wing, same structure here. In our forearm, the kind of bottom part of our arm, excuse me, we have the ulnus and radius, or ulna and radius. And then in the cat's arm or leg, we see the same thing. We see the same thing in a whale fin, and then again in the bat wing. And then lastly, the phalanges or fingers of these organisms all have the same bone structure. Now when we go through and we talk about the use of these limbs, they are very different. A human arm can be used to move around, grasp things, catch you if you fall. A cat's limb is usually used to walk on. They can't grasp things the way that humans can. A whale's fin has been changed or evolved over time to suit its environment so that it can swim, and then a bat's wing obviously uses it to fly. So through the process of something called natural selection, these structures, even though the bones seem to be the same on the inside, these structures of these organisms have changed or been better adapted to that environment in which the organism lives. A whale obviously swims in water, so it needs to use its appendages differently than a human or a cat or even a bat that flies does. Another really great example of comparative anatomy is the finches. Charles Darwin talked about Galapagos finches in the Galapagos Islands, and they all kind of stem from a common ancestor, these birds, but on different islands, they have different food sources and they have different types of environments. So we see over time, slowly over time, these organisms have created different species or changed a little bit to adapt to their environment to better survive. In the example of the finches, we see that the different birds on the different islands had different food sources, and therefore their beaks have developed differently so they are able to eat the food that are on that island. So again, comparative anatomy, we're comparing structures such as limbs, wings, fins, or even the beaks of finches or birds, and see how these things have changed over time to adapt to their surroundings and better suit their environment so they can survive. Another piece of evidence for evolution that we use is called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures in an organism that no longer serve a purpose in present day, but maybe a long time ago in a common ancestor did. The first example you see here is the coccyx. That's your tailbone, and this is just a blown up version of your tailbone or your coccyx. It doesn't really serve a purpose. You could live without it. A really good example I like is the wisdom teeth. A lot of people have wisdom teeth, and some people actually don't at this point. Wisdom teeth don't really serve a purpose in this day and age. It is thought that wisdom teeth were once there because your common ancestors may have needed those wisdom teeth to be able to chew their food, because over time, the way that we collect our food, the way that we cook our food, and even the food options that we have changed. And therefore, over time, because our food and the way that we eat it has changed, also the teeth, our organisms' mouths have changed. Some people don't even have wisdom teeth. So throughout these generations of people evolving, some people in your ancestry or your family tree have developed a trait where they don't have wisdom teeth at all. I, for example, only had 2 wisdom teeth. I had mine removed. I'm perfectly fine. I had them taken out just because they were messing up my nice straight teeth, and I didn't need them, so I had them extracted. Some people let them come in. Some people never even develop wisdom teeth. And your last example of a vestigial structure is the appendix. As far as we can tell, present day, an appendix doesn't really serve a purpose. You can have an appendectomy and have it removed and be perfectly fine. It may be in the past that it served a more specific purpose, where we had a more plant-based diet, and it kind of helps break down the cellulose of plants. And now, because our food sources and the way that we cook our food has changed, we don't really need an appendix anymore. So vestigial structures are evidence for evolution because at one time an organism may have needed these structures, but present day we really don't. Our next piece of evidence for evolution is embryology. So an embryo is an unborn animal baby. All organisms that are animals start as an embryo in their mother's womb. And we see in different examples of different organisms that even though very different organisms develop into different species and have all sorts of different purposes, at the very beginning stages of their life and as an embryo, they have a lot of similarities. As you can see in this picture, these are 4 different types of organisms here, but this is all in their embryonic stage when they're very, very beginning stages of life, and they have a lot of similarities. Each one of these organisms has something called gill slits so that they can essentially breathe in their mother's womb, which is full of fluid, and they also, each one of these, have a tail. Now, because they have these similarities in their embryology, it implies that they have a common ancestor. And a common ancestor could mean that that was 4 million years ago. and that each one of these organisms has evolved and changed and developed into completely different species. Now I'm going to show you which type of organisms. Mostly when we think of gills and tails, we think of an aquatic type organism like a fish. Our first example is actually a fish. Its embryonic stage, very beginning stage, does have gill slits in a fish. Our next example is actually a reptile, very different organism than a fish, but in its very beginning stages of life, it does have a tail and gill slits. Our third is actually a bird, again, a very different organism than a reptile or a fish. And then lastly, we actually have a human. So we know that humans did not come from birds, and birds did not come from reptiles, and reptiles did not necessarily come from fish. But in their very beginning stages of life as an embryo in their mother's womb, they have these similarities that implies that there may have been a common ancestor millions of years ago.